You probably think you know Henry VIII, the infamous king with 6 wives who created the Church of England. But brace yourself, because the reality of Henry VIII is far darker and more disturbing than the polished version in school textbooks. This was a monarch so massively overweight he needed contraptions just to hold himself around. His legs were riddled with oozing sores that stank so badly, attendants would flee the room gagging. And when he finally died, his decaying body swelled up with such force that his coffin literally burst open. What you're about to hear makes Game of Thrones look tame in comparison. From his bizarre table manners to his obsession with extreme security, from the nightmarish way he treated his wives to the revolting decline of his final years, these details completely shatter the image you thought you had of England's most notorious king. His body was a disaster zone, practically falling apart while he was still alive. By the end, Henry VIII wasn't just an old man. He was a walking corpse. Imagine a figure so bloated and diseased that even his closest servants were traumatized by the sight. His waistline stretched an unbelievable 54 inches, wider than the height of many grown adults. At his peak, he tipped the scales at around 400 pounds, in an age when the average man barely reached 140. But here's the really nightmarish part. It wasn't just his size. His legs were covered in gaping, festering ulcers that refused to heal. And these weren't minor cuts. We're not talking about minor injuries here. These were enormous ulcers that constantly leaked pus and decaying flesh. The odor was so overpowering that courtiers approached him with scented cloths pressed to their noses, just to endure his presence. Some reports claim you could smell the king from rooms away. Attending to him was so unbearable that servants literally drew straws to see who would be stuck helping him dress, since being near his infected legs was seen as a punishment. And believe it or not, that's only the beginning. In 1536, Henry suffered a brutal jousting accident that modern doctors now recognize as a traumatic brain injury. He was knocked out cold for 2 hours, something that, at the time, was as close to death as you could get and still wake up. That head injury likely rewired his personality, turning him from a promising young ruler into the paranoid, explosive tyrant history remembers. But there's another layer to his decline. Many experts today believe Henry may have had Cushing's syndrome, a disorder that would explain his rapid weight gain, erratic moods, and those horrifying ulcers that never closed. His own physicians were too terrified to confront him with the truth. Suggesting the king was sick could easily be seen as treason. By the final stretch of his life, the man who claimed to rule by divine right couldn't even manage basic bodily functions. He relied on specially designed chairs that had to be carried from room to room because he was too feeble to control his bowels or walk any real distance. This is the same ruler who would send people to the executioner just for offending him with a glance. And if you think his enemies had it bad, his wives endured something even more horrifying than most realize. Sure, the history books remind us that Henry VIII had 6 wives and beheaded 2, but the nightmare went far beyond a clean swing of the axe. What these women suffered was psychological torment that would make modern true crime villains look tame. Take in Berlin, for example. Henry didn't simply order her death. He staged an elaborate sham trial, forcing her own court musician to confess under torture to having an affair with her. And the cruelty didn't stop there. Before his turn at the scaffold, Henry had her watch as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed on fabricated charges of sleeping with her. She stood there, powerless, knowing she was next in line, forced to witness the deaths of innocent people, all because her husband was consumed by paranoia. Then there was Catherine Howard, who may have suffered the most tragic fate. She was barely out of her teens when Henry married her, and when he uncovered her past relationships, he responded with vindictive cruelty. It wasn't enough to have her executed. He actually passed a law declaring it treason to marry the king without fully disclosing one's sexual history. Imagine being so bitter and insecure that you rewrote the law of the land just to punish a teenager who wasn't a virgin. And the cruelty wasn't always about executions. Henry's favorite form of torment was emotional whiplash. One day he'd drown his queens in gifts and affection, and the next he'd humiliate them, ignore them, or casually threaten them with death. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, endured years of this relentless cycle. In her final years, Catherine of Aragon was essentially kept a prisoner, cut off from her daughter Mary and smeared with rumors that she'd lost her sanity. She died in isolation, some even suspecting she was poisoned, still writing desperate letters to Henry that he never bothered to open. And the cruelty didn't end with her. Henry often forced his wives to sign documents consenting to their own divorces or annulments, as if they had a choice. And of Cleves was so terrified for her life that she agreed to a sham annulment, pretending the marriage never existed, and even thanked him for the mercy of letting her live. Jane Seymour, often called the fortunate one because she wasn't executed, died only days after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son. But Henry's grief was short-lived. Before Jane's body was even cold, he was already considering his next wife. Just 9 days after her funeral, he began making marriage plans again, treating the women in his life as if they were nothing more than interchangeable objects. And here's the brutal truth. These queens had no way out. Divorce wasn't a real option, running away was a death sentence, and resisting Henry didn't just endanger them but put their entire families at risk of execution. Now, let's move to another side of his excess, his eating habits. If you think modern competitive eaters go overboard, Henry VIII would put them all to shame. He didn't just eat like a king. He ate like he was determined to drain the kingdom's food supply on his own. On an average day, Henry consumed around 5,000 calories. To put that in perspective, Henry was eating more than twice the recommended intake for an active adult male, and this was a man who could barely shuffle across a room in his later years. But the real shock wasn't just the volume of food. It was the type of meals he devoured and the strange beliefs behind them. A single feast for Henry might include an entire roasted hog, multiple whole chickens, platters of fish, endless loaves of bread, and oceans of wine. His kitchens churned out over 800 different dishes every day to keep his household satisfied, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. Feeding the king required a staff of more than 200 cooks and attendants working non-stop just to keep up with his appetite. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Henry believed certain foods gave him special powers. Swans, he thought, would make him more elegant. Deer, when eaten in large amounts, would sharpen his hunting skills. And oysters. He was convinced they boosted his performance with his wives. So he gorged on these superfoods like a medieval wellness addict gone completely overboard. Even the act of eating became a ritualized spectacle. Every dish that came near Henry's lips was first tested by several servants to ensure it wasn't poisoned. And his paranoia didn't stop there. He insisted the tasters wait a full half-hour before he'd touch the food, just in case the poison had a delayed effect. Meals turned into theater, with Henry dining in front of crowds of courtiers, transforming his gluttony into a public performance of royal power. Sometimes Henry's mealtimes dragged on for up to 4 hours. Picture it, an enormous, decaying king slowly gorging himself on enough food to feed an entire village, while everyone around him pretended this grotesque display was perfectly normal royal etiquette. And here's something your school textbooks definitely left out. Henry actually banned certain foods from ever appearing at his table. Not because they were unhealthy, but because he considered them too common for a monarch. Everyday staples like turnips and barley were forbidden at court, despite the fact that those humble foods would have been far better for his health than the endless piles of meat, sugar, and wine he consumed. The most disturbing part, even as his body broke down under the strain of his gluttony, Henry doubled down, eating more and more, convinced his royal blood somehow protected him from the consequences. But food was only one part of the nightmare. Henry's paranoia grew so extreme that it warped the very structure of his kingdom. By his later years, he wasn't just suspicious. He ran England like a surveillance state that would put modern dictators to shame. Take his nightly routine. For example, Henry slept with fully loaded crossbows by his bedside and kept daggers hidden beneath his pillow. On top of that, he stationed armed guards inside his chamber, forced to watch him sleep throughout the night. Imagine being so consumed by fear that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses standing guard in the dark. Henry's paranoia didn't just haunt his bedroom. It reshaped the very palaces he lived in. He ordered secret passageways built into every residence, not for romance or convenience, but purely as escape routes in case assassins came for him. He had peepholes carved into walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, and even had primitive listening devices set up in meeting rooms to catch private conversations. But here's where it veers into the absurd. Henry designed an intelligence network where spies were assigned to watch other spies. It created this endless loop of mistrust. Nobody at court ever knew who was truly loyal or who might report their every word. Life in Henry's court wasn't glamorous. It was a psychological minefield where the wrong phrase whispered to the wrong person could land you on the executioner's block. His obsession with food safety reached equally ridiculous extremes. Multiple tasters sampled every dish, But even that wasn't enough. Meals had to be cooked in sealed-off kitchens under armed guard, with every ingredient, salt, spices, even the water, tested by different people before being approved for the king. Something as simple as dinner turned into a full-scale military operation, and his suspicion extended even to his own bloodline. Henry was so distrustful that he placed spies on his daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, convinced they were plotting against him. These were children, yet he treated them like enemy conspirators within his own household. By the end, Henry's paranoia became so consuming that he began executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed. Henry would order executions based on nothing more than a dream he had, or a rumor that someone might turn against him someday. The Tower of London overflowed with prisoners whose only real offense was being near the king during one of his paranoid rages. What made it worse was how contagious his fear became. The entire court was poisoned by suspicion, nobles spied on nobles, servants betrayed their masters, and everyone lived in terror that the next whisper could seal their fate. And you'd think the nightmare ended when Henry died. But no, death didn't put a stop to the chaos. Even his corpse managed to unleash horrors worthy of a Gothic novel. In his final weeks, Henry had grown so enormous that he couldn't walk at all. Servants had to haul him around in a custom-made chair rigged with pulleys and wheels. But the truly revolting part, his leg ulcers had become so advanced that chunks of decaying flesh would literally fall from his body as they moved him. Attendants trailed behind with rags, wiping up pieces of their king from the palace floor. When the end finally came, his death was as grotesque as his life. His body had swelled to such monstrous proportions that his skin stretched tight like a drum. The stench was unbearable, so foul that even his physicians, men who were used to the worst smells of the era, were hardened to the grisliest medical sights of the age, had to flee the chamber and vomit from the sheer stench. When Henry finally breathed his last, no one even wanted to approach his body to confirm it. But what came next was even worse. His corpse swelled so grotesquely with the gases of decomposition that it had to be wrapped in lead sheets and sealed inside multiple heavy coffins. The idea was to contain the rot. It didn't work. On the funeral procession from London to Windsor, the pressure inside the coffin grew so intense that it literally burst open. The lining split, and Henry's remains leaked out, splattering the inside of the hearse. The stench was so overpowering that the entire procession ground to a halt while servants scrambled to mop up the foul mess with buckets and cloths. And here's the nightmare detail. Witnesses claimed dogs lapped up the fluids that spilled onto the road. The king who once ruled by divine right ended up as roadkill scraps for strays. Even his burial was a disaster. The grave had to be dug extra wide to hold his enormous coffin, but the earth kept collapsing under the weight of the lead and rotting flesh. It took several attempts just to get Henry VIII into the ground and keep him there. And still, the chaos lingered. For years after his death, Henry's legacy haunted England, not just through the bloody laws he left behind, but through the paranoia, cruelty, and excess that defined his reign. In life, he terrorized his people. In death, he couldn't even rest without leaving a spectacle of horror behind. Even after he was buried, the horror didn't stop. People claimed they heard strange noises and caught foul odors seeping from Henry's tomb. Some whispered it was his ghost, but historians believe it was simply more gases escaping from his endlessly decomposing remains. And here's a chilling detail your teachers never told you. Several of the servants tasked with handling his corpse died within weeks, likely from infections caused by direct contact with his rotting body. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charming, larger-than-life monarch of popular culture, but a grotesque cautionary tale. A man whose own body betrayed him just as brutally as he betrayed his wives, his subjects, and his kingdom. Driven by paranoia and gluttony, he warped England into his personal nightmare, ruling not with dignity but with fear. By the end, the most powerful man in the country was reduced to a prisoner inside his own decaying flesh, and even death couldn't stop the chaos he left behind. Henry's true legacy isn't just the Church of England or the story of 6 unfortunate queens. It's a grim lesson in how absolute power can twist a man into something monstrous. And if these disturbing truths made you rethink everything you thought you knew about history, stick around, because there are countless more dark, hidden stories that textbooks conveniently skip. Trust me, this is only the beginning.